Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 5th of February 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio is Mike Robinson, and we'll be joined by live video Skype link by David Scott, who will be bringing us news from north of the border with Northern Exposure. Well, first of all, the weather in Plymouth, pretty grey, mizzy, gloomy, bit misty, bit on the cold side. A little bit depressing. Certainly my spaniels were depressed and weren't too keen in going out. I mentioned it to them and they said, well, the only thing they could think of more depressing than the weather was David Cameron, which surprised me coming from a Cocker Spaniel. Well, what have we got? Brighton is white out. North of the border apparently is grey and uniform weather. We understand that this has come in from the European Union. And Brighton is described as a whiteout. I'm not quite sure what that means, but a lot of whiteness in Brighton. Well, David, we'll bring you in straight away. We're here to do what? I think we're here certainly to protect the future for our children, and our children seem to be coming under attack from a variety of different directions.
Yes, they certainly are. We have a wee bit more for you on the named person scheme in Scotland. The campaign against this is continuing to gather momentum. The petition is now up to over 17,000 signatories, and was in fact the reason that the recent debate in the Scottish Parliament was carried out. And here we have the Scottish editor, Alex Massey, for can't quite read that there now. The
Spectator.
The Spectator, yes. He's commenting on the dubious philosophy that underpins the named person scheme, and dubious it certainly is. There's an awful lot of very strange science coming in from assorted institutes and think tanks, and ultimately from the UN, a lot of it. And this is influencing how we're treating our children and how we're treating families in Scotland.
Right, well, the UN, really, we haven't even got started on the UN because, of course, policy that we see coming in from Europe can ultimately be tracked back to the UN. And certainly we'd agree with you, David, that the policy coming in around schools, education and our children all coming in from UNESCO, some of it directly from the UN into our civil service. But we're heading towards a happy planet, presumably.
Well, you have to understand it's all about well-being, Brian, and well-being is very difficult to pin down, but it kind of means happiness, or maybe mental health, or maybe something in between. We're not quite sure. In fact, recently when a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament asked a member of the government for his definition of well-being, he got shouted down and basically told he should be ashamed of himself for even asking. So, well, we're brave, we'll ask the question. And no one is better to ask the question of than a world-recognised expert. That's what it says on his own website. World-renowned expert on happiness. This Mr. Nick Marks, and he's been doing TED Talks on happiness. He's written books on happiness. He is a happiness guru, and he explains what well-being, which is the basis of the whole named person scheme, what well-being actually is. I want you to just let this flow over you because it's quite beautiful. Well-being is not a beach you go to and lie on. It's a sort of dynamic dance, and there's movement in time, and actually it's the functionality of that movement which actually is true levels of well-being. So there you have it. That was said on Radio 4. So it must be right, and that's, I'm sure, you find cleared everything up.
Well, I'm surprised he's got a website entitled NAF. I thought that was a sort of expression, derogatory expression, which disappeared out in the very early 80s, but maybe I'm wrong.
In fairness, it's NEF.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. It must have been a slight Freudian slip because I was feeling happy as I listened to his happiness report.
So David, he is, if we just go back to that previous one, he is a founder of Centre of Wellbeing for NEF. And you asked earlier on about NEF, who they are, and so on. And I just thought I'd remind everybody who funds NEF, because this is quite amazing list. In fact, the Cabinet Office provides money twice. First of all, through ScienceWise, £180,000, and then further on down the list with Nesta. But we have all the usual suspects here, various foundations and think tanks and so on.
Roddick, for example, Joseph Rowntree.
Yes.
The Gulbenkian one is a very interesting one because they're involved in all sorts of dirty stuff, and that originates in Turkey, I think.
So interesting organisation, the NEF. So we'll not say any more about it than that at this point. But it's interesting that he's involved with that organisation, and I'm not quite sure what well-being has to do with economics. Perhaps we're getting into the area of behavioural economics there.
Well, it's always a good thing to mistrust anybody who says they have a new economics. There's 500 years of very careful analytical thought underpinning economics, and to cast that aside and say, oh no, we need something new, is usually cover for, oh no, we don't like the answers it's giving us, we don't like reality, we need a new narrative, we need a new story.
Yeah, okay, what can we do? Carry on exposing it is the simple answer. Well, if the named person organisation is going after children, certainly north of the border, but we can see it coming in south of the border, England and Wales. We've also got Common Core. Now, this is hitting America, but it's beginning to filter into UK education system as well.
Yes, I love this Common Core, Kat. This illustrates exactly the effect that Common Core maths education has in the minds of young people. That's exactly how it makes you feel. And most educational innovations that take root in America seem to come here in fairly short order. So I'm sure we'll be seeing more and more of this in years to come.
David, we'll just read that out for our listeners. Basically on slide, which is taking the mickey of Common Core calculation, but it's saying if you have 4 pencils and 7 apples, how many pancakes will fit on the roof?
And the answer's purple.
Yes,
because aliens don't wear hats.
Yep.
Yes, this is, and when you see the Common Core maths, that's exactly what it is. It's completely chaotic and incoherent, and produces confusion.
And of course, if there's confusion in the mind of young pupils, they're not going to learn fast enough. They're not going to learn properly. They're not going to have confidence in their own ability. So it's being presented as the new way of presenting education, but what it's actually doing is attacking the minds of the children, or it seems so to me anyway.
Yes, I mean, there's a whole lot of work that I would encourage people to read on this subject. The work by John Taylor Gatto is outstanding and illustrating how you actually should go about educating young people, and very largely allowing them to educate themselves. It's fantastic, and one of the things he found is the entire schooling system from very early on was about control. It was about fitting people for a particular role in life, and it was not about intellectual development and enabling them to think critically and think for themselves. The bells, the whistles, the routine, all aspects of schooling mitigate against true learning. So his work is to be highly recommended, and he's on YouTube as well as in book form.
Okay, David, thank you for that. We've got the Leipzig connection here, which I think we've had on screen before.
Yes, the Leipzig connection is an early link between psychological, behavioral psychology research in Germany, in Leipzig, which was essentially working on from Pavlov's dogs, etc. It was treating people as animals, and it was learning how to train them as such. And that this link via Skinner, B.F. Skinner, which you've got on screen there, and his operant conditioning, came into American education and was then disseminated by people like John Dewey, who was head of the Institute at Columbia University for teacher training, and was enormously influential in the United States and worldwide in training teachers and influencing how education actually developed. And the early days of this, they were quite clear about it. What they were doing was re-engineering society. they were changing their people's beliefs, they were introducing socialism via the education system, and they were looking to eliminate such unwanted traits as loyalty to nation, to family, faith, and other matters which they saw as holding us back.
And all of those things we can identify, I think, in the European Union system coming into play. We're going to be coming on to that a little bit later in today's news. But everything geared at young people, because, of course, you control children as they grow up. They create the new society for you. Well, Mike, can we trust our politicians to protect the children? Mr. Farron has put himself forward as a champion.
No, we can't. And this has been a theme over the last week or two, the issue of so-called unaccompanied children being brought into this country from Syria. And as we have said, despite the fact that these people do need help, these children do need help, there's no question of that. The question is what they're going to find when they get here and how they're going to be treated when they get here. And I was particularly concerned that, bearing in mind the situation with children going missing in this country, and I was asking the question, would Tim Farron be making sure that none of these unaccompanied Syrian children go missing in this country? Well, a number of people have been kind enough to write to Mr. Farron and ask for some clarification on this. And we've had our first response back, which I wanted to share with everybody. And Mr. Farron, of course, didn't respond to this himself. This isn't a significant enough subject for him to respond to. But the response came back: thank you for taking the time to write to Tim with a number of questions regarding the Liberal Democrats' call on the Prime Minister to take up Save the Children's call to allow 3,000 unaccompanied child refugees into the UK. While Tim would not have the time to answer each of your questions in detail, we are of course keen to see any and all children that come to the UK receive the appropriate care. One of the first things the Liberal Democrats did in government after the coalition was formed in 2010 was to end the routine detention of children seeking asylum, as had become common practice under the previous administration. You can read more about the Liberal Democrats' policies at that URL. Best wishes, Sam Lewis, Office of Tim Farron MP. So basically, this is not a serious enough issue for Tim Farron to respond to himself, nor is it serious enough, as far as he's concerned, for him to respond to it in detail. And the best that the Liberal Democrats could say is that children are no longer kept in detention when they come here seeking asylum. So this is a pretty despicable response and doesn't lay to rest any of the concerns that many people have, including ourselves, that once children are brought into this country, they'll disappear into the care system or possibly disappear right out the other side, never to be seen again, and trafficked.
Mike, excuse me, Mike, there's certain irony here because, of course, when those children were in detention, they were in a known place. So the Lib Dems have helped release those children into the very environment that can target them. But, of course, the whole problem of refugees and the children of refugees clearly is a result of the Russians, or so it would appear. David?
Yes, here we have yet another in a long line of articles in the British mainstream media, led of course by the BBC, casting the Russians as the bad guys, the Russians as the people destabilizing the Middle East and causing the refugee crisis. So here we see Russian bombs triggering mass Aleppo exodus. Nice word to choose, exodus. We've got an appropriate scene there for exodus, and it's not anything to do with any of the other participants in this, not our own governments and American governments and NATO's attempts to destabilize the whole area, not the funding by Arab countries such as Saudi of the insurgency, of the violence of insurgency terror groups. None of that. No, it's the Russians. It's all the Russians. And the Russians are causing this by supporting the government that actually tends to bring some stability to areas. So it's a very strange way of interpreting things. It's almost certainly greatly exaggerated for propaganda effects. And it's another example of why we can't trust the mainstream media in this country whenever they're talking about Russia.
I would agree with that, and we're going to be talking about the BBC's angle on Russia in a minute. But we've also got a claim that 90% of people killed in drone strikes were not the target. Huffington Post here reporting this.
Yes, here we have the clinical and accurate Western version of bombing Syria and bombing Iraq and bombing Afghanistan and bombing Yemen and bombing lots of places. It's very high tech and it's very precise, and we're told we shouldn't really be alarmed at this extrajudicial murder, including sometimes of our own country's citizens, without trial, without warning. But it now transpires that 9 times out of 10 we actually get the wrong people. So that is going to stoke up huge resentment, conflict, and retaliation, I would have thought, and continue to destabilise the whole region.
Which seems to be the objective of our Western governments. We probably should have a whole programme on the Middle East, because it's becoming so clear that David Cameron's agenda is destabilisation. That's why he's talking about transforming the region. He needs to get rid of the countries in accordance with his instructions. I'm going to be crunchy.
Some of the countries, not all the countries.
Not all of the countries. This is true. Well, Israel remains a big powerhouse and, of course, is pulling the strings of British politicians, at least in some cases. David Cameron's, I would suggest. But some criticism here of what Israel's been up to.
Yes, this is a journalist explaining how he saw children basically baited and then murdered by the IDF, and there's lots of examples of IDF targeting children, and via including snipers, where people can see what they're doing. We're not talking about heavyweight munitions causing collateral damage. We're talking about things that should be somewhat precise, ending up in children being murdered, and we're seeing a society ever more divided and ever more hostile to one another in the Middle East, and it bodes very badly for everybody in that region, for Jews and for Palestinian Arabs as well. The basic view of the typical IDF soldier. I had an example, an interaction with them up on Temple Mount, up in Mount of Olives. A few years ago, they were trying to turn a large vehicle with a low loader with a bit of excavation plant on the back of it, and they'd made a bit of a mess of this and got it jammed, and they were obviously getting a bit nervous, and I thought it was quite a funny scene, and obviously showed this. So one of the soldiers came over to remonstrate with me, basically, I was filming it. He told me to stop filming it. So we had a little discussion about it being a free country or not, and he told me it wasn't. It was Israel. And then he pointed at the general Arab population round about, which was mostly shopkeepers and people doing their daily shop, and a few small people, a few small boys and things. And there was no trouble coming from them at that point at all. And this soldier says, "See these people? These people are the people that carried out 9/11, which is nonsense. These people had no idea about it." And it just shows you the level of animosity felt by certain elements within the IDF for the Arab population. It makes it a powder keg.
It also shows, David, the power of the international media and the ability of organisations like the BBC to absolutely brainwash people into believing something is true when it isn't. But many people starting to look at what Israel is doing and who is creating the policy, and you've picked up on this Observer article here.
Yes, this is there was an attack on Hamas comparing them to the Nazis, and this was opposed by Holocaust survivors who had left Europe to escape Nazi atrocities and Nazi terror, and they were condemning Israel's behaviour in Gaza, as indeed many Jews do, many religious Jews and many other people who simply think or who have sufficient empathy for a fellow man look at what's going on in places like Gaza and realise instinctively that it's wrong, that it's counterproductive, and that it should stop.
Okay, well, this brings us on to very heavy stuff, which is building around Russia. And you've picked up on this amazing tweet that's come out from the Russian embassy. What is this about?
Yes, this is the BBC article which you showed on, I think it was yesterday's programme, where the BBC were asking us all to make decisions about nuking Russia in various scenarios leading up to World War III. In all of these scenarios, Russia was carrying out various atrocities and sinking ships, and the HMS Ocean was mentioned specifically, which I think that represents. And generally, Russia was painted as the agent forming the trouble, the agent causing the degeneration of an otherwise peaceful Western-led world into war. Something which I can't see has any relevance to the truth. We're seeing the countries which are promoting destabilization of the world being the European Union, Great Britain, United States, and certain Arab allies. We're not seeing Russia as being the destabilizing force. It's just not true. Now, here we had the Russian embassy, having picked up this report from the BBC, are tweeting out essentially a complaint. We're seeing the BBC reporting and propaganda, for that's what it is, causing causing actually friction on an international scale. We're seeing it causing diplomatic problems that brings in the Russian embassy to comment on it. So was that the role of the BBC? Are the BBC meant to sabotage our international relations with other powerful nations? I didn't think that was in their charter.
Well, I'm going to say I think it's absolutely in their charter. Let's see if we can maybe prove that. But we just come up on this one, which we showed yesterday. It was the Independent reporting Russia Today being told off because they dared to criticise the BBC and said the BBC was involved in the faking of pictures of the results of a Syrian chemical attack. Of course, Ofcom defended the BBC, but we would say we're highly suspicious of the BBC's report. This was the bit down at the bottom. The Russian government-funded RT suggested the BBC had broadcast its report on the game-changing atrocity to persuade the public of the case for military action in Syria. Well, UK column team would say, Russia Today, you're absolutely right. This was propaganda to help David Cameron's policies. Well, have a look at this, because Russia Today is obviously now on the case. This is BBC advertising a position for its, quote, jihadist media team. Well, there's a bit of an irony in it, because, of course, what they want is somebody supposedly to listen out, an Arabic specialist, to listen out on jihadists or to monitor social media. Here's BBC Monitoring's tweet saying they're recruiting an analyst, but there's the expression, it's jihadist media team. So is the BBC monitoring, or is it helping create the jihadist movement for the public? There's BBC recruitment. Are you fluent in Arabic? We're looking for a media analyst to join our specialist jihadist media team. Right, what is BBC monitoring? Well, we have gone into this a little bit before, but we thought we'd dig into it again. Here's BBC monitoring website. And if we have a look at it, they're bringing the world to us. BBC Monitoring observes, understands and explains media throughout the world, providing an accessible and relevant account for you to make better, more informed decisions. So we need these people apparently because we are too silly, too stupid to understand what the media is saying in other countries. And don't worry, because BBC Monitoring is going to interpret it for us. Well, who are they exactly? Well, they're buried in 3.65 billion worth of BBC propaganda machine. Where are they? They're down here. Now, originally they were Foreign and Commonwealth Office, so funded, so they were absolutely an agent of the British government. But the government said, well, we haven't got any money apart from wars, so the taxpayer, the license fee payer, TV license fee payer, is now paying for the BBC monitoring effort. So very complicated organisation. You think the BBC is there for the general public, but no, most of it is now profit making, but none of that profit is returned back to the licence fee payer. So we had a look at their website in a bit more detail, and we were astonished to see this, a massive attack by BBC Monitoring on the Russian state TV, which had been criticising the BBC over its panorama reports. So if we look what was going on here, the Russian state TV's presenter, Mr. Kiselev, if I pronounce that rightly, had launched an attack on the BBC, that is the BBC's word, coruscating attack on the BBC over its recent panorama documentary, Putin's Secret Riches, which contained allegations that the Russian president was corrupt. What a wonderful thing for the BBC to go when we've got the present Conservative government. But this was the meat of it, that this man concluded by suggesting that the panorama film was part of a much wider agenda aimed at bringing about revolution in Russia and getting rid of Mr. Putin, because he said Putin is like a bone in their throat. Well, that seemed to be pretty accurate to us because, of course, we've reported, amongst other things, the role of the BBC's charity Media Action in destabilising Eastern Europe into the Ukraine, but also, of course, into Syria and many other overseas countries where they declare they are helping regime change. Well, of course, we reported yesterday on this BBC Two programme where the BBC portrayed Putin and Russia as thugs. Look at the faces presented to the public. Here, of course, is the aircraft. So we've got a skinhead thug. This is the BBC saying to the British public, this is how we would like you to look at President Putin. So if we give you the rest on BBC Monitoring, here they are. It's part of the BBC World Service Group. We're going to come on to them in a minute, but Francesca Unsworth is the big boss of that. They were created in 1939 to spy on the Axis powers in World War II. So this is basically a government spying agency, paid by the licence payer, originally paid by the Foreign Commonwealth Office, as we've said. Offices throughout the world, Europe, Russia, Caucasus, Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East and Africa. Nowhere is safe. And they've got customers. Now, this is interesting because we think they're the BBC, but no, they're working for foreign governments, embassies, security groups, news agencies, academic libraries, well, not many of those left, think tanks, non-government organisations and international businesses. So this is a quasi-political corporate spying organisation, which of course is pushing out propaganda. Who heads it up? Well, it's this woman, because she's the director of BBC World Service Group, appointed to lead an empire of global news, which apparently has a weekly audience of 265 million. And we notice this, that she also chairs the BBC's international charity, BBC Media Action, but that charity, of course, said it was independent of the BBC. So we're a little bit confused. Should we trust this lady? Well, we had a little dig into her expenses, always a good place to go. And we're interesting to see that she charged the taxpayer £14 because she was running late. And obviously it's difficult to afford a taxi on £215,000 a year. And presumably she can't organise her day to get around on time. She's also got her meetings with BBC Monitoring. And of course, she's going to be meeting with the government because the government says the Foreign Commonwealth Office hasn't got involvement, but it has. And then we get hints of other things, because here is £93 spent on hospitality, thanking the team, who are anonymous, for their Libyan coverage. So we wonder whether this was perhaps a news team helping the subversive downfall.
Would that be the Libyan coverage that showed people waving Indian flags?
Well, I think it could be. I think it absolutely could be, because the BBC keeps saying these are simply mistakes. We've got a budget of 3.65 billion, but we're making mistakes. I think something very, very dirty is going on here. The BBC is infiltrating countries, and then it is using BBC reporters to stir up subversive activity. And what the Russians are claiming is correct. But if you don't want to go down that route, have a look at this. This is her personal interest. We were interested to see this, that she's a member of Erasmus Mundus Advisory Board. Well, not many people know what that is, so we thought we'd help. Of course, this is part of the European Commission, and its job is to link universities throughout Europe so that they are all in agreement with the European project is a better word. It goes on and on in a big network, but this is the woman who is apparently unbiased in the BBC's reporting over the European referendum coming up. David, I've done this very quickly for the news today, but as you get into this, it is just outrageous what you are finding in the BBC. This is a government and corporate sponsored propaganda machine. And it seems to me that the Russians are absolutely right. This organisation is trying to whip up major warfare, or if not more than that, in the Middle East. I find it interesting that I'm sitting here saying this as somebody who went through a lot of the Cold War period, when, of course, the West was the good guys and Russia was pumping out the propaganda. And now I'm taking a look at the BBC and saying, whoa, something's very wrong. What do you think?
Very wrong indeed. I mean, that was a fascinating analysis of the links between the UK government and the BBC. Don't you just love the way that the BBC always describe Russia Today as the Russian government-funded broadcaster, as if they're not? Yeah. Right? Okay, it's a license fee, but it's basically a tax. You're not allowed to have a television without one. And if you try to leave the country now, through an airport to go on holiday and you haven't paid your license fee, you might be subject to arrest and detention by UK border security. So if that is not government funded, I hardly know what is. And in terms of editorial content, yeah, there is propaganda. There's a spin on Russia Today when they're talking about Russia. They're not my first port of call for information. But they're far more diverse in their opinions in the BBC. They have many, many different voices on their programmes. They have many more points of view given an airing, and they're far less controlled than the BBC. And if there is spin, it's quite obvious, unlike the BBC stuff, which is quite subtle and tries to nudge the viewing public along particular ways of thinking. Ways of thinking which are bizarre and harmful. I mean, why do we want to be destabilizing the Middle East? Why do we want to be trying to get involved in a shooting war with Russia over Estonia or over Sweden or over the Ukraine or whichever, or Turkey or whichever other of umpteen flashpoints that are currently on the horizon?
Yeah. Well, we'll continue to dig, but you've now moved us nicely to another topic. The taxpayer's paying for this, the taxpayer. We've got a picture here of a very happy well-being. She's full of well-being as a taxpayer, this lady. I better shut up. What would you like to say?
This is dear Kezia Dugdale. You can always tell when there's an organisation in terminal decline when they constantly change their leaders and they can't last any length of time. That is Scottish Labour these days. A poll out in the Sun today showed the Labour Party are only 2 percentage points ahead of the Scottish Conservatives. So they might actually end up third at the next election. And in order to turn their prospects around, has Kezia opposed the name person scheme? No, she's all for the name person scheme. She just doesn't think the nationalist government is introducing it well enough. It's just maladministration. There's nothing wrong with the state watching every child and every family in the country. That's obviously okay. It's just we need to be more efficient about it. So that's her starting point. So building on that, she's decided that the way to persuade the Scottish people to vote Labour again is to say, we're going to tax you some more, because that makes everyone feel happy. So she's introduced an extra, or she's wanting to introduce an extra penny on income tax. This is a penny that you pay just for being Scottish. I don't know, Brian. I don't think that's going to play too well.
No, we hope not. We hope not. But the BBC's on to tax, so we can...
Well, you see here, the nationalists are not having any of this extra tax on Scottish people for being Scottish. Oh, no. We don't want to do that. They have, obviously, a political dog in this fight. They have to be selling independence on the basis that you will get more free stuff, that you will get more for less, that with independence, basically, it's one long free lunch. So they can't start that discussion by putting up tax, because that would rather be admitting that, in fact, out there in the harsh real world, things might not be quite as nice as they are in the UK. And that doesn't suit their agenda at all. So they have to pretend that they don't need to put up tax. So they're opposing the move.
Well, you don't need to put up tax. You could tax a bit of property.
Yes, you've got to find the money somewhere, Brian. I mean, times are hard. So we're going to tax property, yes, and we're going to tax high-end property, because it's okay taxing rich people. Because rich people, soaking the rich is fine, because you only have one vote each, and there aren't many rich people, so, what are they going to do? So the nature of democracy is that people with stuff will tend to have their stuff nicked by majority voting. That's the way it will go. So we're going to see that, but unfortunately, for every effect there's a cause. For every cause and effect, you will see attacking the housing market will affect the housing market, because taxation is ultimately the power to destroy.
Right. Well, okay, we're not sure about income tax, we're not sure about property tax, but there's also another tax being mooted north of the border.
Yes, we've got Edinburgh's very successful and is attracting lots of tourists, because it's a lovely place to go and spend some time. It's a very nice city. I would heartily recommend anyone listening to go there, but go soon before the taxation goes up. We're going to start taxing bedroom spaces in Edinburgh, £1 per bed per night. But they realise that might not be very good if you're staying in the Balmoral. £1 is not a big issue. If you're staying in a bed and breakfast on a budget, it maybe is. So they might actually be varying it a little bit. But they're looking to tax the success of the tourist industry in Edinburgh, just the same way they taxed the success of the oil industry a little while ago before it stopped.
Okay, well, I wonder whether we might just pop that one back up on screen, because I have to say, with a bit of cynicism, I looked at that very dark picture there and wondered whether that was a BBC monitoring jihadist attack on Edinburgh there. Has the BBC gone into action in the field?
It's actually not, but they might use the still as an example of a jihadist attack one day, because it's about as relevant as showing Indian people in a piece on Libya.
Yes, okay. Well, not to worry, because we've got another happy lady here. Everybody north of the border is smiling. I haven't been to Scotland for quite a while. I think I need to get up there to be happy. But Scotland's going to be transformed. That's always a slightly unnerving word.
Yes, transformed. Transformed from a modern liberal democracy that brought ideas of freedom and liberty to the world to something else. Basically, this is an organisation, it's called Common Weal, with a mixed socialist and fascist past to that name. It was a magazine back in the turn of the previous century with Morris, amongst other people, running it. It's now a campaigning group and think tank in Scotland, and they have never met a tax they don't like. They want to tax everybody, particularly the rich. They really don't like the rich. And they don't seem to have any fears of perhaps strangling the economy and, in fact, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. they've issued a book called 101 Big Ideas, and if you want to see stupidity in action, I heartily recommend the book. It's every wrong move for a nation in one handy volume.
Well, maybe we should get hold of a copy, David, and we should take one apart a day or a week or something, and see where we get on it.
That sounds an excellent idea.
I reckon that'll be tied into big society. Well, just back to the BBC, because Venezuelans are posting pictures of empty shelves.
Yes, if we're going to transform Scotland, we're going to transform it into, I think, Venezuela. Because here we have a country which has got a lot of oil resources and really should be thriving. And thanks to socialism, it is in fact not thriving. It's got runaway inflation, it's got huge unemployment, and you can't buy anything, particularly toilet paper. For some reason, under socialism, the first thing that runs out is the toilet paper. But then that's followed by everything else. So you've got all these shots of empty shelves in Venezuela because there's nothing there. And this is wholly due to government intervention in the marketplace. They've put in price controls. The price controls are such that it pays Venezuelan people, to export their goods to other countries and sell them there, because the price controls mean they can't sell them in Venezuela and make a living. So as a result, there is no food on the shelves in Venezuela. This reminds us of the old Russian joke from back in your day in the Cold War. The Russians used to say, what would happen if socialism took over the Sahara? And the answer is, well, for the first 10 years, nothing. After that, they'd run out of sand.
Okay, thank you for that. But of course, we needn't worry, because the churches are going to solve the problem, and the Church of Scotland's got a cunning wee plan here.
Oh, yes, they have. Where do you start? The Church of Scotland, Commonwealth, sharing through tax and giving. Now, do you see any slight difference between the concept of tax and the concept of giving, Brian? The difference is, of course, the presence or absence of a bayonet in your ribs to make sure you comply. They've got here a little bit entitled "The Joy of Tax," and efficient. It's quite wonderful. It's almost BBC-esque in its use of language. An efficient and fair taxation system is essential to reducing inequalities in our society, because taxes are used to support a just and compassionate society. Are they now? Are they really? We've been taxing the living daylights out of our nation for several hundred years. I don't see that the inequality has gone. No, the inequalities are rising. And so the tax supports a just and compassionate society. Tell it to Holly Gregg. Tell it to all the people who've been abused in this society. Tell it to all the people who've taken these stories of abuse to the police, to the judiciary, paid for by our taxation, only to be told, we're not listening to this, sunshine, because the person you're accusing is too important. So, just and compassionate? I think not.
Okay, well, not to worry, because of course we've got referendums coming up, and SNP's gaining in power. So we can relax, can't we?
Well, the SNP is going to win a landslide in Scotland. That's a given. There are certain weird things in the Scottish political system that now come into play. You've got two votes in a Scottish election. You've got a vote for a constituency and a vote for a party. If your party wins a lot of first-past-the-post constituency seats, and the SNP will win them all, or almost all of them, because the anti-SNP vote is splintered between 4 or 5 other parties, then you don't get any of the top-up seats that are meant to make it more proportional. So the roughly half of the Scots who are going to vote SNP. They have a second vote that, if they vote SNP twice, doesn't get them any more seats. But if they vote for some other left-wing, loony, independent-supporting party, such as, to pull a name out of the hat, the Greens, then they get two MPs for the price of one promoting a split in the UK. So it could be a very dangerous election. And it's all against the background of the Tories gaining ground because they're opposing the named person tyranny, and Labour losing ground because they don't actually know what they support anymore.
Nice bit of nudging in the picture with the European flag, first and foremost. This is a poll showing that there's a drop in the Scots in favour of the UK staying in the EU. So nice little nudge headline there.
Yes, the support for the EU is still quite strong in Scotland, but is falling. The support for the EU in Britain as a whole seems to be falling quite fast, and it's now, we're told, a majority for leaving the EU. So we'll see how that plays out. And of course, we have been told, and you see, told by none other a person than the glorious Alex Salmond, that if Scotland votes to stay in, and if Britain as a whole votes to leave, then the irresistible effect of this will be another independence referendum. This is an independence referendum a few years after the first one, which was, of course, in the words of Alex Salmond, a once in a generation issue. So we can't really trust too much that comes out of Alex Salmond's mouth, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm afraid you can't trust a bit more, because yesterday I had the pleasure of interviewing a remarkable man, Mr. Dave Barmby, who has been analysing the real documents about the EU from the 1970s. He's produced a book, which I'll show you shortly. But in relation to what you've just said, I couldn't resist bringing this particular slide up. This is one of those declassified documents. And in it, it says there is no problem at all with BBC TV Scotland. All of those involved in news and current affairs are pro-marketeers, and we can depend upon them to press for as much time as possible. And the document also said, I have written to the regional organiser of the European movement in Edinburgh. So we can see a nice cosy little relationship here, both with the BBC and the European movement and the European Communities Information Unit, EICU. Real document. Dave Barmby's book has all of these documents and there for you to see. We're going to bring in another one in a minute, but I'll just pass it back to you because you've got Mr. Cameron here, EU Vote Leave campaign. Oh, it's hit a record high.
Yes, yeah. It seems there's quite a variation in the polls, actually. We've been told a lot of different things over time and for different parts of the UK. But we're now being told that nationwide that we are going to vote in large numbers to leave. So we will see. My prediction would be if that happens, we'll need to vote again, because the tendency in the EU is if you vote the wrong way, you have another go and another go until you get it right. But maybe that's only Ireland and France and Denmark that has to do that. But,
well, Mike Robinson thinks that we're going to be told that the leave vote is winning because it makes people complacent and they don't want to get out there and vote. But the Telegraph was telling us a little bit more here. Telegraph Politics today, a report on Cameron talking about the referendum in Parliament, and they're saying that it was a sort of thin gruel for Tory MPs. So the Eurosceptics weren't really on fire. They seemed to let Cameron get away with his little weekend in Europe. They're saying that he's definitely hinting strongly that June the 23rd, in the middle of the football, will be the referendum. But this was the bit that he told wavering backbenchers not to be swayed by what your constituency association might say, but do what's in your heart. So David Cameron, leader of the Tory party, saying to his own MPs, don't really pay attention to what your constituents are saying. Should we be surprised? Well, let's jump back to the 1970s. This is the same, I think this is from the same document, but it says there should be a programme for such speakers should concentrate on constituencies represented by MPs who were doubtful about entry. This is the European movement in collusion with the Conservative government at the time, saying they were going to get in and disrupt meetings and challenge meetings where local MPs were against the European Union. And then it also says down here they were going to introduce a campaign of letter writing to MPs by constituents. And of course, those weren't real letters. Those were letters being put together by government departments, but sent to MPs as if they will. And I'll just jump on through here pretty quickly because, of course, it was Francis Maude, Mike Robinson pointed out, who was boasting that there were Tory plans to reform government communications to help deliver more effective communications, ensuring maximum value for hard-working taxpayers. What he really means is they're going to up the propaganda. Is it happening in UK? No, this is a top German media boss, Mr. Herles, who said live on TV that basically German news reports were being controlled by Mrs. Merkel herself. She said which one she wanted out and which she didn't. And if you want to get into the heart of the European project, which is a corporatist racket, this is Dave Barmby's book, which you can get from Books to Buy. It is absolutely brilliant. It is full of evidence, the real documents, and we can now see the same scam used in the 1970s to get us into the European Economic Community being used now to drag us into the EU. I'll leave you with a spotlight, David.
Yes, I went to see this a few days ago. It's an excellent film. It follows the Spotlight investigative journalist team in the Boston Globe as they track down and expose the child sexual abuse which was rife in the Roman Catholic Church and was being covered up and indeed facilitated by the very highest people right up to cardinal level in the church organisation, who were simply moving the abusing priests from parish to parish, moving them on every 2 or 3 years after they had abused children once again. There was never any reporting to the police. There was never any stopping it. It just continued on. And it was in Boston alone, almost 100 priests. So you can imagine how many victims. It's a fine film. When it finished, the people in the theatre, most of them just sat quietly thinking for quite a noticeably long period of time about what they'd just seen. And it illustrates that if you do have courage and you do speak out, things can be done. Of course, in Britain, we're much better at covering up than they are over in the colonies. And people have bravely spoken out in Britain, but we're not seeing anything changing. We're seeing further cover-ups.
Okay, David, thank you very much for that. So a book and a film, encourage people to have a look at those. Thank you for an excellent report and analysis from north of the border. That's it for today. As we always say, don't sit and do nothing, do something, because action conquers fear. We just need enough people to dig at getting the lid off this corrupt Conservative government, which seems to be angling for World War III. Can we stop it? Of course we can. We just need enough people to do a little bit each. We'll be back same time on Monday. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.